Alexandria, 415 CE. The young philosopher backs up, her bare skin touching the altar. She partially covers her naked form with her long golden hair and reaches up towards the heavens to, wait, hold on a second. This cannot be right. I mean, Hypatia was 45 when she died and really probably wasn't a blonde. And not to put too fine a point on it, but why does she look so, like an American Apparel ad? It's because this isn't Hypatia in 415 CE. Why, it's Charles Mitchell's 1885 painting Hypatia, based on the romantic novel published 30 years before. Yeah, okay. So, hold on. How exactly did we get from the celibate middle-aged philosopher to what I can best describe here as a Victorian peep show painting? Well, buckle up, extra historians, because you are in for a wild ride. Thanks so much to Incogni for helping to keep people's personal data personal. According to one ancient source, Cyril essentially got away with Hypatia's murder. The case went to Constantinople, where Cyril's agents bribed an official, and the case never came to anything. Meanwhile, Orestes, unable to really establish himself in Alexandria, left Egypt shortly thereafter. But hold on, how sure are we that Cyril actually had Hypatia killed, or even smeared her to such an extent that the mob did the job for him? Well, turns out, not very. In fact, of the oldest sources that discuss Hypatia's death, only one even mentions Cyril by name. And while modern scholars disagree on the extent of his involvement, almost none suggest that he put out a hit on a prominent Neoplatonist philosopher. This, of course, didn't mean he was totally innocent either. It's pretty obvious that he encouraged violence towards religious minorities, which contributed to the climate that caused Hypatia's death. Cyril was no saint. He was a jerk. But here's an odd thing. His jerkiness also kind of exonerates him from being the architect of this specific heinous act, because he was a man with a lot of enemies. See, Cyril was properly famous. In fact, we technically said a little fib earlier about him not being a saint, because he actually is a literal one. And he's a saint for reasons that didn't make him very well liked. Saint Cyril of Alexandria was a zealous and aggressive enforcer of what he saw as doctrinal orthodoxy. Yeah, Cyril hated him some heretics. In fact, the bits about him in this series is generally a footnote in a long life of suppressing and persecuting fellow groups of Christians and making spectacular appearances at councils that defined the early church. You can actually see more about this in our series on early Christian schisms. And the enemies Cyril made in those campaigns were more than happy to sling any kind of mud his way they thought might stick. And what do you suppose is notably absent from all of the things people accused him of? That's right, any responsibility for Hypatia's death. This is important to understand when interpreting the records surrounding Hypatia's murder, because the most accusatory early source was written by an Alexandrian named Socrates Scholasticos, who was clearly writing from a strong anti-Cyril position, and who also had a very good reason for his hatred. Scholasticos was a Nestorian Christian, and when Cyril came to power in 412, his first big project had been to expel the Nestorians from Alexandria and destroy their churches. And this account set early patterns that later historians would follow, essentially projecting their own values, beliefs, and boogeymen onto the death of Hypatia. The most influential of these was Damascius, an Alexandrian philosopher, who was the final head of Alexandria's academy, which had been founded by Plato. It taught philosophy, Neoplatonism, rhetoric, and possibly mathematics, before the Emperor Justinian shut it down and expelled its scholars. At that point, some of the last pagans left in the city. Damascius wrote his account of Hypatia while in exile, clearly using her as a vessel to process what was happening to him. He cast Hypatia as a heroic martyr of Hellenistic culture, snuffed out by a branch of unthinking Christianity. A scholar who embodied the light of ancient culture and learning, shining against the eclipsing ignorance of the new faith. And while we now know that this was extremely detached from reality, the church continued valuing Neoplatonic education and insight long after Hypatia's death, and she regularly worked with Christians, it did set the mold for later accounts. Damascius's version was then recopied wholesale into the Suda, a sort of Byzantine Empire version of the encyclopedia, and it became the most well-known account of her life and death. It was this version that English historian John Tullard then drew upon in the early 18th century when he cast her as a symbol of Protestantism, a belief system he saw as one of reason and progress, attacked by the regressive and ignorant forces of Catholicism. French philosopher Voltaire did much the same, using Hypatia's murder as an allegory of beast-like Catholic monks killing a woman who represented the belief of rationalism and natural laws, free from dogma. But to make Hypatia a true posthumous superstar, that took another man. Actually, a man you probably know by name. All right, folks, it's time to get hyped, because you are about to meet one of the most famous historians of all time. Ooh, here he comes, all the way from late 18th century London for his first extra history appearance. Roll out that red carpet and get your autograph pens ready for the author of Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Edward Gibbon! Hey, it's Edward Gibbon, y'all. All right, give it up. Yeah, love this guy. It's great. Okay, listen, I'm gonna level with you real quick. We couldn't actually book Edward Gibbon. He's a big star, real busy guy. So this is what we got instead. It is a Gibbon, obviously, named Edward though. So you got that, Edward the Gibbon. We hoped no one would notice, but anyway, moving on. Gibbon's Decline and Fall is a great book, one that changed history writing and even today thoroughly shapes public understanding of ancient Rome. Chances are if your boyfriend is constantly thinking about the Roman Empire, it's this guy's version. But it's also a book that, arguably, might have had fewer distortions if it were written by our Edward here. Because what you need to know about Edward Gibbon is that he really liked foraging in the treetops for fruit and bird eggs. Wait, no, sorry, got confused again by the ape in the wig. Let's rewind. What you need to know about Edward Gibbon is that he hated organized religion, especially the Catholic Church. Much of his theses on why the Roman Empire fell is that it adopted Christianity. And he was only too happy to jump in and shape the narrative around Hypatia. Here is where the villainization of Cyril really became crystallized, with Gibbon suggesting that Cyril was directly responsible for Hypatia's murder. He also suggested that Cyril was jealous of Hypatia's wealth and popularity. This depiction became wildly popular, because in 18th century Britain, they were extremely anti-Catholic, and Hypatia's story was used as a symbolic analog. Though, ironically, in Catholic countries, she was simultaneously venerated as a saint. Yep. See, often stories of early Catholic saints were invented through the unintentional mingling of memories. And that's what historians think happened with Saint Catherine of Alexandria, who was supposedly an educated and erudite Christian woman who would convert pagan scholars through debate. Most historians believe that this figure was an accidental mixture of Hypatia, whose method of death was similar to that of a Christian martyr, with similar events in the 3rd century when Alexandrian mobs set upon and killed Christians. Ooh, and fun fact, Catherine of Alexandria was one of the saints who appeared to Joan of Arc. And yeah, I would definitely read a time-slip crossover comic about that. And we could do this all day. In 1853, novelist Charles Kingsley published a book called Hypatia, or New Foes with an Old Face, a romantic novel that not only cast its villains as evil Catholics, but Hypatia as weirdly young and sex-driven for a lifelong virgin who may have died in her 60s. However, this depiction of Hypatia as a young and erotic woman living in an exotic setting was very sellable for theater companies, photographers, and painters, like the 1885 painting we began with. By the 1920s, she started to be seen as a champion of science versus fundamentalist religion, as well as a martyr for feminism. Claims that got particularly distorted since a lot of authors in the early 20th century just straight up invented parts of her biographies, further muddying the narrative. However, probably the most important moment in how the modern world saw Hypatia actually came from Carl Sagan in Cosmos, who unfortunately drew on all of the wrong sources in telling her story and made it sound like she was killed for being a scientist. No shade though, Carl. Still love you. And to be honest, we could easily spend a whole episode on the 20th century distortions. Richter Weiss movie. Excuse me. But it really just be over-icing the cake, you know? What it comes down to is this. Hypatia was an amazing woman, both for reasons we can discern from the records and likely many that we'll never know about, who came to a fate that she didn't deserve for reasons we'll probably never know the full details of. Yet her story has stayed with our culture not just because it is tragic and shocking, but because we humans are storytelling animals that simply cannot help but put ourselves in her place, making her stories about our own times. Something in our collective imagination lets us reach across the bounds of space and time to feel connected with this philosopher we barely know. It really is a sort of magic, a bit perhaps like touching the infinite intellect of her Neoplatonic thought, where we're all brought closer together. And while that feeling of being a part of something is a truly wonderful thing, sometimes, in the modern world, there are groups that take things a bit too far. Scammers and data brokers, I'm looking at you! And until you chill out, which I'm sure will be any day now, I am super thankful to have Incogni. Until we started working with Incogni, I had no idea how much of my personal information was being sold and published by data brokers online. Spoiler alert, it was a lot. Not to mention data breaches leaking all of our personal information saw an uptick of 41.5% worldwide, according to the Identity Theft Resource Center. That is a yikes. And your data being sold or stolen could lead to any number of issues, ranging from the annoyance of constant robocalls, all the way up to the absolutely catastrophic stuff like identity theft. But now with Incogni, I'm not alone in this fight, because after a very speedy sign-up, they got to work bombarding these data brokers and people search sites with takedown notices to remove my personal info. Plus, they keep the pressure on, using regional laws and ordinances to make sure that my data stays removed even when new sites pop up. And it's easy to keep track of all this through their real-time dashboard and email updates. Like this week, my report, as you see here, showed my personal data has now been scrubbed from over 200 sites. Go team! So if you would like to keep your personal data, your personal data, you can get 60% off Incogni right now by visiting incogni.com/extrahistory and then using our code extrahistory. Or you can get started by clicking right here. And then once you've ruined a data broker's day, why not check out another of our videos here to celebrate? The biggest being thanks to Angela Valenciana, Arclight Games, Dominic Valenciana, Hunter Z, Ilknerg, Izzy Coin, Joseph Blame, and Kuya Koi for being the best legendary patrons.